Jonathan, thank you so much for being here today. It's great to get to meet you, if only over Zoom, and speak to you about this really exciting research. So, I was hoping maybe you could start by talking a little bit about yourself, your research background and interests, and kind of how this project came to be.
Sure, yeah. So I have a bit of an unusual background. I have to remind myself of that sometimes because I think everyone at Rand has a pretty unusual background. But I think it's what drew me there. I actually started my career and training as a designer. So I worked in the game industry briefly, and I worked in the tech industry doing product and service design, and moved into doing business strategy a bit. And I had this interest in kind of working on larger systems and moving, into social impact and policy, developed an interest in that direction. And so I started going back to school. I found the Rand Graduate School, which is a very, very special, unique program that's housed at the Rand Corporation. So I've had the opportunity there to work on policy projects in a number of areas, and develop kind of a direction for my research. I was always really fascinated by complex systems and complexity theory, and bring kind of my design thinking background and kind of the analytic focus of Rand to working on just big wicked problems. And through some of that work, I was looking at topics like food security and systemic risk and racial wealth gap and wealth equality. So all these like very grand, big picture kind of problems. And I developed this interest in looking at cities, which is kind of a cheat in a way, because I didn't really have to pick a topic then, because cities, of course, are kind of an intersection of everything. And thinking about urban development policy. So in a way, it was kicking the can a little bit, but still, trying to look at this big question of how to make, how to improve the welfare of people today, and also thinking about future generations and maximizing the choice that people have in the future for making the world better. So it was driven by a lot of that nexus of issues of personal well-being and resilience, inclusivity, equity, and uh, so my dissertation topic ended up zeroing in on looking at this question of well-being and trying to understand urban well-being in a more kind of holistic and comprehensive way, and then how that would translate potentially into looking at sort of larger non-structural change. And then my third, which is the focus of this work in particular, and then my final chapter is looking at a technique for longer range transformational planning, kind of in that context, but hopefully something that's applicable to other kinds of problems as well. So that's a little bit about my background, where I came from, and how this fits into the context of my dissertation.
Yeah, it sounds like it kind of fits right in there. So the research that we're talking about today is really utilized an agent-based model. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, that's
Okay.
a good question. I didn't focus on that, in my writing, because it gets a little nitty gritty, but it does actually, it's an important component of it, and why I was able to look at some of the things that I did in this research. So for those, I guess anyone who watches who's not familiar with it, a lot of the classical urban economics research, and like a lot of economics research, uses what's called a representative agent approach and equilibrium analysis. So in that approach, you more or less kind of treat everyone, every person or every firm as if they act basically the same, and act independently of each other within the system, and follow the same kind of rules, same kind of behaviors, and usually centered around some sort of like a maximizing process, right? So this allows you to structure and frame problems in a very elegant and useful way, where you can use calculus or numerical methods to get at like where a system will tend to go in the long run at equilibrium, or some kind of a concept of a steady state. And you can play with assumptions within that, and look at how that would change the steady state, or how different policies would kind of affect the long term. And it's very useful, but there are some limitations with that, driven by those assumptions. I think one of the biggest is that although you can look at how that steady state might shift, it doesn't really say anything about how long it's going to take to get there, or kind of what happens in between and to whom. So we're thinking about other social costs and side effects and kind of the burden that's borne along the way. It's a little more challenging to address that in that kind of approach. And also because of the kind of assumption that everyone mixes together and acts in a fairly independent way, it could get really hard to capture things that would result out of these emergent interactions between people and how they're connected and arranged together. Game theory, of course, tries to get at some of that, but that is difficult to scale up to a large population. So in an agent-based model, all of your, in my case, households, but all of the actors are simulated explicitly over time individually. And that allows things like arbitrary heterogeneity across all of those agents. So they can have different preferences, they can follow completely different rules if you want them to. And importantly, they can interact with each other and the environment. So that becomes a really important if you're interested in the like dynamics and looking at transitions between two states, or even assuming that there's not a steady state at all, which is often the aim of doing that kind of modeling. So in my case, that ended up being very important, in particular, looking at trying to incorporate this idea of social capital or community as an example of an endogenous amenity that would interact with some of these policies. It's not just about where people are and just looking at consumption and the economic side, but also how the importance of community and place attachment can form through those connections. So rather than trying to impose something top down on that, I wanted to see how that could kind of arise more organically within this, and what that would have to say about the effects of some of these policies.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. So that brings me to my next question about sort of the specifications of your model. So you're not looking at a New York City or a Detroit. This is a
Right,
completely
yeah,
fabricated reality. So what were some of the assumptions that you sort of baked into this model, and what were you really looking to test?
Yeah, again, it's a really good question. I think there's this adage that's out there that's attributed to George Box, the statistician, which a lot of people are familiar with. But if you haven't heard it, it's always a good reminder to hear that there's this idea that all models are wrong, but some are useful. Right? You're always having to simplify and pick and choose something, which things you're going to kind of keep in and what you're going to simplify or leave out or leave abstract. And the hope is that by removing the detail, you're left over with some form that says, something useful. And in this case, there were already a lot of moving pieces. I had the development decision side for landlords that each period in the model, the owners of a parcel, who in this case, and this is a first important assumption that I made, is treating the owners as absentee landlords. And I did that for a few reasons, and the main one is sidestepping, in this initial version at least, concerns about like wealth accumulation and capital accumulation and kind of recirculating that within the world that I was looking at. So everyone on the household side are renters. Another part of that is both the landlords and households I treat as infinitely lived agents. So once an agent is created, they can stay, they can move around the cities, and they're making those choices over time, and they can enter and they can leave the city. But there's not a sense of like having to make life cycle choices. Like, do I save now versus spend later? Am I going to rent or buy? Am I going to buy multiple properties and then rent those out to others? That's some of that is actually some work that I have done on different projects around looking at the racial wealth gap, and that we did an agent-based model that was based on an overlapping generations framework that incorporated a lot of those kinds of decisions, but it was this macro scale model that didn't have space. So it had all that stuff. In my case, I have the spatial components, but I don't have the life cycle piece. So I think joining those together would be a really exciting frontier for this. And that's probably one of the big ones. And there's a lot of other simplifications that I had to make that I generally did actually follow a lot of the conventions in classical economic models as a way to kind of marry it up with that literature, so that if I turned off a lot of the features, I could sort of replicate what was out there and then introduce more of these complexities, because agent-based models do definitely give you enough rope to hang yourself with. It gets complicated very quickly, both to build and to analyze. So just to kind of make sense of where things are going on, my agents are mostly myopic. They're only kind of looking one period at a time. They're still acting as maximizers effectively. They share most information, so they have a lot of common knowledge about the world. Everyone kind of knows what everyone's willingness to pay is for everything. And there's a common way that both the agents and for tax purposes, the local government calculates land value, and that's assumed to be consistent and is kind of aligned with the market valuation as well. So in reality, of course, all of those things are not true. And it does limit a little bit about what I was able to look at with some of the more behavioral finance kind of aspects of things, like withholding land from development and speculation kind of aspect of this. It ended up really looking at just the incentive effects of some of these policies and how the agents interacted. And then in terms of developing and kind of running the simulations themselves, one of the big so again, with these urban economic models, the first separation of these is whether you're looking at intercity or intracity models. So how people move or kind of are distributed between locations, or what's happening of space within a city. So that's what I'm looking at, is that piece. And then generally you have this a choice between making an open or closed city. And so in a closed city model, in most of these studies, you have a fixed population that's always there. And it's just kind of a question of how they're arranged in space and what utility or well-being they're able to achieve within that. If you have an open city model, generally how this handles that everyone has sort of a reservation utility or well-being level that they can attain someplace, and they have to achieve at least that level to stay in the city. And if people are better off than that, then there'll be, more people come to the city. And if they're worse off, then they'll leave. So the population fluctuates, but typically that well-being level is able to change. The agent-based model is interesting because you kind of get a little bit of both worlds. Every agent can actually have their own utility level. It's just the last agent needs to be able to reach that reservation utility, but you can still have this inflow and outflow. So there's a little bit of both you get in this format, which is kind of unique. So that did leave a problem, though, especially because with an agent-based model, because of all these interactions, there's this quality that's referred to as path dependence because of those interactions where history matters. I could, if you were just to impose, like, here's just a random scattering of agents, that might not be a sensical or even a valid arrangement to start with. So there's still a question of, like, how do you, where do you start with this if you don't have any of that history? So there's a couple approaches to doing that. And what I ended up doing was basically scaling the income level down initially, which again was another huge simplification, is that the labor sector wages were left kind of completely exogenous. There's a lot sketched out on paper to incorporate more of that into the model, but again, I kind of left that as exogenous. But I turned that down initially so that the population is basically zero to start, and then there's this ramp up period where that income kind of grows up to and then levels off at kind of a target level. So then from there, the city during this kind of pre-simulation period grows to a relative stable or steady state. And that's where I apply my policies and kind of see where those differences appear. So I think that catches the most important things. There's a lot of
There's a lot
assumptions
of
here,
nuance,
but yeah.
I think that's a really great foundation for understanding the next piece of this, which is that you did test some policies to see how they would affect the behaviors and what's happening on the ground in this world that you created. So could you talk about the policies that you tested, why
Yeah.
you were interested in them, why you were interested in the interactions between them, and what was the motivation there?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the concept of the land value tax itself, I found this really, really interesting topic. And when I read Henry George's Progress of Poverty, and saw that this long running movement around it, and there seemed to be this kind of popular idea. Well, it seems to have this resurgence every couple of decades or something, and it seems to be kind of coming into vogue again. But when I was looking at the literature, a lot of the last wave especially seemed to be looking mostly at land value taxation as a tool for urban sprawl and kind of encouraging this idea of the compact city. And that actually sent me down a bit of a rabbit hole and kind of thinking about growth and densification and the compact city idea, and thinking about how there's these trade-offs with that process. For one, that I was kind of surprised to not see it touched on very much, was the impact of that densification on the well-being of households, both good and bad, because there's a lot of natural goods that come out of agglomeration economies and things like that. I mean, there's a reason why we're attracted to cities to begin with. So in some cases, density is good, but there are these trade-offs that there's a whole other strand of literature that's kind of discussing those. And one of the main things was, things like the loss of green space in cities. So if that's the goal, is making things more compact, but then also how do you retain the livability of things? And then again, one of the original drivers for George, as I understood the work, was this observation that despite this, this growth and development, it also came with this great disparity in who was able to participate in that. And so there's this underlying tension from different groups all across the political spectrum of feeling the sort of loss of agency in our cities, and this tension between this idea of trying to shape and plan cities from the top down versus this other view of looking at cities as complex adaptive systems and kind of this bottom up process where form follows behavior and function. So that kind of expanded at least it helped me kind of understand where I want to situate the land value tax, and then looking at other kinds of mechanisms that are really at the roots of that, that are exploring the importance of space and shape and structure of all of these issues. And so the land value tax was my starting point, but then as an alternative, I became interested in looking at these other kinds of incentive-based mechanisms for changing land use. And there's looking at subsidies for green space, and this concept of payments for ecosystem services was something that has been used in conservation efforts, usually in unsettled or rural areas for larger spots. I hadn't really seen that discussed at a micro scale like this. And so that became an interesting framework, thinking of it potentially beyond just subsidies for green space, but also other kinds of human created ecosystem services potentially. So in this case, I looked at pairing the land value tax with this payments for ecosystem services specifically for green space, and wanted to look at how that might compare to what happens with a more top-down approach through building, in my case, something like a green belt, or public parks that are not necessarily emergent in that way, and kind of comparing how those would work over time, and for different types of households.
Okay, yeah, no, I was really thrilled to see that you were testing the interactions between an LVT and some tools to preserve green space. We do a lot with LVT, as you probably know. I talk to people a lot about LVT, and one of the questions that often comes up relates to green space. So, I have a side yard, and I think
Mhm.
it's important. What about community gardens? Sort of like, it's great that there's this option for a replacement for a traditional property tax that will incentivize land reuse. However, we don't want everything built on. So what do you do about that? And so typically what I'll talk about is the fact that LVT is really one tool in the toolbox, right? So it's good at a number of things, but it can't do all things, right? And so
Yeah.
the idea is that you need to have some intervening policies that are going to ensure that you do have green space. So in the case of this research, you are looking at the effects of combining those things. So your findings were super interesting. Could you talk to us about what you found when you ran this model? What happened?
Yeah. So to be honest, the biggest surprise that I found, and again, this is, it can't not follow the way that the model is set up to begin with. So I was helpful reminder, this is not real life. But what was interesting is that I found that with the land value tax alone, when I initially did that, I kind of with the employment sector and wages, I had construction costs were also constant. And so if I tuned those in a way that was somewhat realistic. And the issues with the land value tax is that yes, it did prompt development, more development by removing the disincentive to developing fully, of course. So that's not a huge surprise. What was a little bit more surprising there was that, of course, it also happened everywhere, which wasn't once you saw it, it's like, well, I guess it's kind of obvious because it's now there's a greater incentive to build everywhere. So the anti-sprawl effect was not as powerful as I thought it might be. It did not lead to a more kind of compact form. Now, part of that is because of the way that the market and the population is set up. If this were, as I mentioned before, the open versus closed city model, one speculation I have is that if I did configure this as a closed model, and you're just looking at how existing people rearrange themselves in that space, it may only make sense to do that development closer to the city core. But once you open it up and there's the prospect of new households coming in, now that could lead to an unintended pattern of development on the fringes as well. And that's something that I did see when I went back into the literature, and there's mixed evidence around this that shows even in the empirical work that can go both ways. The next sort of surprise that I had was when I introduced this slightly increasing cost to construction with each new project within a given period to kind of reflect the idea of supply elasticity, because there's limitations to materials and labor, and that's something that we're seeing that's been a huge thorn in the real economy now in over the past 10 years, right? So once I introduced that, even a very, very minor change, it actually ended up slowing development considerably when I imposed land value tax compared to my counterfactual, where I just retained this uniform tax rate on both pieces. And I think that's mostly driven by the way that was incorporated into the evaluation model that landlords would look at. I think my takeaway from that was, if there's kind of volatility or changes in those supply constraints, there's less margin to work with if everyone is like really kind of walking that line perfectly. And so there's a little less. You did still see some development. If it did, it was still kind of scattered everywhere. But it did have, again, a sort of unexpected slowing effect that way on its own. Now, when I started combining that with other kinds of changes, both my examples of public parks and the introduction of payments for ecosystem services, what was interesting there is that overall it did you saw a little bit more of the expected development patterns, but in all these cases, I guess even when it slowed development or appeared to not be having some of those intended effects from a form perspective, it did serve a really important role in kind of capturing those what had been profits, surplus profits, and we're circulating those in the form of what I treat as a kind of a composite public service. So would represent, infrastructure and public programs and public safety. I rolled all that into this kind of one abstract good, but it was able to provide a much higher level of that service even in those cases. And I think what's most interesting there is, again, because I was able to look at individual households by different income levels, and I could look at these different strata on that level. That was a case where the land value tax on its own ended up benefiting these lower income households much more than higher. So it ended up being a very progressive effect on that sense. So I found that kind of interesting because I felt it went back a little bit more to the original drive for this as a mechanism for eliminating or reducing those disparities. Now, in practice, that could, of course, be treated a lot of different ways. Instead of a public service, it could be more of like a direct cash transfer. Like there's a lot of ways that those resources could be used, of course. It's different here, but that overall welfare effect was quite different in that case than I think I expected. So it's an interesting surprise to kind of see this mixed evidence that supported some of the different narratives that we've seen out there in the literature on this.
Can I ask a question, just a follow-up to the sort of less expected results that you were seeing in terms of sprawl effects or the lack of anti-sprawl effects and the impact of even a marginal increase in construction costs. When you were specifying the model, did your world start with LVT and continue with LVT, or did you
No, oh
start
yeah,
with a
yeah,
traditional property tax and then
right.
shift?
That's a, yeah, the good question. So when I talked about initially having this period of growth where I started from sort of a blank slate, zero population, and then at this run-in period, for all of the experiments, that those initial conditions were to not have any of these policies in place. There's a uniform tax policy, no green space initially, other than what the landlords would have kind of developed on their own, which there was some, but not much. And the main reason why on the green space side in particular that was the case is while households would value the green space both in the place they're living and at the surrounding neighborhood, the landlords couldn't capture that. They couldn't charge for the value that they were giving to surrounding households. So a landlord might want to position like a higher density development where there's a bunch of green space already, but then the other owners of those parcels are kind of doing the same. So you end up losing a lot of that anyway, with and without the land value tax present. Anyway, so to answer your question, during that period, that ran for about 30 years, and that would got to around like a population of around 20,000 and slowed to a pretty realistic growth rate of just like, a couple percent of new households per year. But then it would be very stable. So then at that point, I introduced either changes in tax policy or if there was a public park scenario, I would convert those parcels following a particular pattern to green space or start distributing the payments for ecosystem services.
Okay, that's interesting because as you were sort of describing the findings and the ones that were less expected, I was thinking, talking to municipalities that actually exist in the real world and are contemplating the policy, one of the ways that they can anticipate, sprawl diminution and sprawl pressure, right, is the fact that a lot of land in the city center and more central locations is tied up at the time that they implement the policy. And so the idea is that the policy like disincentivizes people from holding land. And so suddenly you have this tranche of maybe it's not all at once, but relatively close to the implementation, you see this tranche of land that whether it's completely vacant or it's underutilized,
Yeah.
that becomes available for market activity. And so the sort of added cost of developing on the periphery, having to convince the municipality to extend sewers and roads and all that stuff, like it's much easier to build where that stuff exists, and so you see the sort of
Yeah.
development
Yeah.
shift back in that direction.
Yeah, and that speaks to another, one of the many simplifications that just realistically had to be made here. I'm not modeling infrastructure or connection costs or things like that. That might influence those development patterns. So that's one thing that probably affects that decision as well. And the holding cost, having this underutilized and empty lots, vacant lots, that's a piece that I found with this, since I'm really only was looking at that incentive effect on the incurring the additional tax burden on the property, removing that piece of it. That was really the only channel through which you would see increased density in the model as it currently stands, because there isn't a sense for landlords of say speculating about future growth necessarily. Or comparing the cost of development to just holding on to it to perhaps sell at a profit, or if there's some other kind of agreements in place around that. So that's that more behavioral component, I think, would be one of the natural and very important extensions to this, and moving away from this the model of landlord that I have into some more realistic kinds of speculative behaviors, and just building out the land market more fully, kind of the way that I did with the housing side.
So based on the findings of the model, it sounds like you have some thoughts about if you were to continue the work, how you might amend some elements of it, but you got some really solid results. So based on what you found, you have policy recommendations for places that are thinking, hey, maybe LVT makes sense for us, or maybe we need to incentivize green space preservation and creation. What recommendations might you make based on the model?
Yeah, well, I think that it's the land value tax on its own. I think what this shows is that I mean, as you said, it's not panacea. And it's also going to, I think this at least shows some evidence that there's important concerns with making sure that the timing and other kinds of contexts, make sense for it. It's how this might interact with other policies that are in place, the history, history matters. I mean, I think that's something that is very clear in this model, and in any real situation, it's going to be different kind of considerations in place. But the reasons why places are vacant to begin with, and even the direction of growth in the city, if the city on the rise versus on the on the decline, there's a lot of situational things like that that will matter. So I think I hope that it could contribute to the kinds of some of the kinds of cautions that you need to put into place and really assessing and evaluating a land value tax policy to put into place, and what your goals with it are. Um, uh, and looking at, I mean, clearly looking at the interactions with supply chain. If you put it in, I mean, if you apply this, developers may want to, but they literally can't because no one can build anything anyway. So there's a lot of other supporting pieces that obviously need to be in place for it to have that desired effect. I think looking at it as a tool for densification as opposed to how it can be used as another channel to address things like economic equity and opportunity, for example, or how that that process unfolds is, I think, another side of that dialogue to reflect on and assessing those, and the dialogue that you have with members of the community and stakeholders that have a voice in that process. But I think that does lead to this a kind of more complicated discussion too around how we, consider things like collectively created value and, the idea of the commons, while still, really energizing individual autonomy and agency and choice. Right? So there's a really careful balance there that I think is worth reflecting on both as policymakers and the kind of the dialogue you have with your community. And on the payments for ecosystem services side, again, I think there's a lot more work to be done on that because, again, in this case, I think that it ended up having a very powerful effect. There's some surprises with that as well that we didn't really touch on a whole lot. But targeting the right level of that and thinking about how that would be funded, of course, there's a lot of things that I was able to keep simple, within this case, but kind of understanding how to value those spillovers, whether you're looking at green space or other kinds of amenities. There's a lot of nuance with making that work realistically. So I think there's more work to be done on the modeling side and through kind of developing out the theory around that before jumping onto it. But I think it shows there's a compelling case here where that could be something that's worth exploring, both in understanding how to target those kinds of amenities, and also in developing a path that hopefully is more resilient and adaptive to things that we don't expect. So I think it's one of the great challenges in trying to implement those kinds of things from a more of a top-down or design-oriented vision for a space is you have to make a lot of assumptions about what people want now, but also in the future, and how things will evolve and the direction that they'll take. So I think that that's something that also is worth exploring, and maybe finding some ways to pilot a program like that, which there may be similar things that people have experimented with, but it's not something that I've seen in the public discourse that much.
I have certainly not seen it. I know with places that are looking at an LVT, there's certainly awareness of wanting to preserve open space. I know, like in Detroit, there was a program, years ago where people were able to purchase side lots to their properties, and now there's concern of, well, what happens if we end up with an LVT and suddenly I'm being taxed on this lot? I think they paid $100 or $150 for because it was vacant land at the time, and so the answer is, well, that will not be subject to the LVT tax rates, right? So, there's other, obviously zoning and whatnot, can be used as well to make sure that green spaces remain untouched. but yeah, it's complicated. And that's I have also not seen that particular policy used in an urban context. But it's a really interesting idea, and it sounds like it had some really definitive impacts on what the agents did in the model. So that's really kind of interesting. So you touched on it a little bit already, but do you have thoughts about future research in this space, or even just maybe not directly, but inspired by this work?
Yeah, well, I think there's a tremendous amount of work to do on this. I really saw this version of my model as a launching point to hopefully build on and expand. Um, it is, of course, tempting to try to boil the ocean once you start putting some of these details in. um, of course, but I think some of them are obviously, some are more crucial than others. And I think that, at the very least, looking at uh, how things like the life cycle, effect would turn to this, and like what happens with the accumulation of wealth, because that's thinking about the longer term well-being. I think that's a huge factor in it. One of the other aspects that I think is worth building out more is diving into these interactions with the local economic sector and the interplay between livability and appeal, density, agglomeration effects, and how that works into the economy in kind of both good and bad ways. Um, that's something that I have sketched out on paper based on the Fujita and Krugman and Van Abel's spatial economy work, which is a crucial part of that. So I don't have to get into the details of that, but there's, looking at how like what, wages and income would be endogenized, and also breaking that down potentially into multiple sectors. So like how does this interact with if you have a strong knowledge sector or a manufacturing sector and a services sector, for example, and especially if there are changes in that in an environment to trying to make that transition between those, and like how does policies like these interact with those kinds of changes as well. Because if you make a place more appealing, of course, there's crowding effects and congestion, there's displacement and concerns about gentrification, and there's winners and losers with all of those things. And so I'm able to capture a surprising amount of that, even as with the model as it is. But I think building up both the economy side and the city of having agent life cycles. And as we talked about, a lot more of those kind of speculative behaviors and landlords, kind of making that piece more realistic as well. So I think those three together, there's a ton of more moving pieces to look at, but the potential is there to do some pretty interesting kinds of things. So I think that's kind of the direction where I'm thinking of with this in particular, and for other kinds of policies too. I should say, like the payments for ecosystem services. Like I said, one thing I'm very interested in. In fact, my first paper, my dissertation, the way that I looked at social capital in that was using the density of third places as kind of a proxy for that. So if you're not familiar, these are the venues that are not work, not home, where important social interactions take place. Because otherwise, it's notoriously difficult to even measure or monitor social capital, of course, at this kind of level. So it'd be interesting to look at, a space like that, and if we're thinking about the human habitat, and what other kinds of positive spillovers do you want to internalize into these development decisions in a way that you're not trying to like plan ahead, for the next 100 years, but working those into those kinds of bottom-up decisions. So, yeah.
It sounds like the research possibilities are pretty endless, which is exciting. And the really nice thing about the kind of research that you're doing is that you really have control over how you're going to specify everything. So you're not having to look for real world applications of these policies
Yeah.
and disentangle all of the real world complexities to try and get at what you're looking to explore. So it's really exciting work. Well, Jonathan, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been great to hear about the work that you're doing, and I'm so glad that we were able to support it.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. It really, it would not have been possible without this, and it allowed me to go to kind of a depth that I didn't think would be an option. So it was really exciting to do this work and to share this, and to think about all the places where we can go with it. So.